April 1787, and King Louis XVI was yet again without a Controller General of Finances. Calonne's dismissal left the office vacant, but it would only be vacant for a short while. The vultures had been circling Calonne long before his dismissal, eyeing up his post greedily. One of these vultures was Lucien de Brienne. He had been a supporter of his old friend Turgot, but opposed the reckless loaning of Necker, even if he had lent the former Director General his quill for the penning of the Compte Rendu. More recently, Brienne had proved instrumental in the ousting of Calonne and galvanizing resistance to reform. With Calonne out of the way, Brienne began a correspondence with Louis, essentially pushing a narrative that the proposed land tax was too expensive for the clergy and nobility to tolerate. Major concessions would have to be made by the royal ministry if they expected to make any progress at all. Winning Louis over to this position was no mean task. The king carefully reviewed the figures Brienne used to back up his claims, but in the end he found they all added up. For his efforts, Brienne accomplished two goals: a neutered land tax and the top job of Controller General. Assuming office on April 19, 1787, Brienne found himself in an unprecedented position. Only weeks earlier, he had been within the Assembly of Notables, fighting the king and his ministers at every turn. Now, on the other side of the argument, Brienne was expected to spearhead the reform effort. Funny how things work out. In this tough spot, Brienne's first move was to reconvene the Assembly of Notables, which had gone into recess upon the dismissal of Calonne. Louis personally reopened proceedings on the 23rd, by offering to abide by the recommendations Brienne had made. It was expected by the king, Brienne, and the Conseil de Roi that the Assembly of Notables would receive this news warmly and engage in some constructive back and forth. But the notables were over it. Emboldened by their total victory over Calonne, they expressed no intention of submitting to an absolutist autocrat or his sycophantic ministers. The new Controller General was tarred and feathered in the press. Various publications portrayed the notables as humble servants to the king, who were only too eager to compromise on issues of reform. Brienne, they asserted, was the one making negotiations impossible. Pro-absolutist press, pamphlets and pundits countered these claims, and so began a tug-of-war for public opinion. And it was on the back of public opinion that the Assembly of Notables took a firm stand. They offered to organize an independent committee of notables to assist the Ministry of Finance in drafting reforms. Failing this, they offered an independent body to be established, its members picked by the Parlement to adjudicate fiscal oversight. Of course, both of these offers were utterly anathemic to Bourbon absolutism. These were thinly veiled attempts to influence the content of the reforms and diminish the authority of the king and his ministers. That the Assembly of Notables even had the gall to envision such a system was extremely concerning. Clearly, they had motives ulterior to their mandate. Louis and Brienne, therefore, pulled the plug on the Assembly of Notables on May 25th. The notables left feeling pretty good about themselves. They'd held their ground, prevailed over absolutism. The king, on the other hand, had left the ring with a bloody nose and a tattered public image. Amidst the political fray, already deplorable economic conditions continued to worsen. The Ministry of Finance warned that French coffers rang hollow. The kingdom was on the verge of bankruptcy. Reform was still the royal response. They had to get these reforms passed somehow. The only alternatives were more loans or bankruptcy. Brienne, having dismissed the Assembly of Notables, was thus presented with only one avenue to pass reforms: to go to the Parlement directly, to get them to register the reforms. His predecessors had tried their best to get past the intransigent Parlement, but failed. Could Brienne do any better? Well, let's just say things are going to get ugly. Nonetheless, he did have an ace up his sleeve. Where other controllers general had heavily relied upon Louis, Brienne could count on the support of the Queen. As the king slipped deeper into a depression after the failure of the Assembly of Notables, the Queen had assumed an outsized role in royal government. She had never really relinquished her seat on the Conseil de Roi in the aftermath of the diamond necklace affair. Marie Antoinette was energetic and assertive, offering her opinion on all matters of state. Together, the Queen and Brienne made quite the dynamic duo. She really was the right man for the job. And yet, none of this was without consequence. Already a pariah after her lambasting during the diamond necklace affair, the rumour and conspiracy surrounding the Queen assumed a dark and vicious character. As she became more intertwined with royal government, she also became more culpable for its failures, chiefly financial mismanagement. For this, she earned the nickname Madame Déficit, and was popularly believed to be lining her pockets with funds defrauded from the treasury. Trouble at home, combined with trouble abroad. France's international prestige was suffering due to some intrigues in Holland. The long and short of it is, grossly oversimplified of course, that in the United Provinces, the ruling House of Orange was facing a brewing civil war. A Republican faction known as the Patriots, favouring independence from foreign influence and a stronger national identity, aligned with the Kingdom of France. King Friedrich Wilhelm II of Prussia, sensing that this potential conflict would upset the delicate balance of power in Europe and threaten his plans in northern Germany, preemptively invaded. In response, the French mustered their armies and rallied to their allies' aid in what became known as the Great Swamp War. No, actually not really. What really happened was that the French did absolutely nothing. Brienne and Marie Antoinette argued against intervention, citing the lack of funds for such a venture and the adverse effects it would have on French credit, considering that half of France's creditors were Dutch. They carried the day, but the price of neutrality was steep. To other kingdoms, and to detractors at home, France appeared weak and inert. This was also the first definitive proof of France's fiscal problems to the rest of the world. It's not as though France's internal strife was a secret, but it was now undeniable to the other great powers of Europe that France was in dire straits. Brienne had in the meantime made overtures to the Paris Parlement, hoping to register his reform package. He met with the Parlement in June, achieving some early successes: the deregulation of domestic trade, the establishment of provincial assemblies, and the restructuring of the corvée. Still, the conservative backbone of the Parlement absolutely refused to hear out Brienne's proposal for a land tax. Parlement's concern was less with the tax itself and more with the fact that they didn't get any say in its form. So incensed by the land tax and so invigorated against its registration was the Parlement that they launched into a fresh volley of acerbic derisions of the king and his ministers in various publications around Paris. In trying to find some legal justification for their obstinance, Parlement settled upon an old set of laws which prohibited new taxes from being registered by anything less than an Estates General. Now, like the Assembly of Notables, an Estates General was a convention of various interest groups from throughout the kingdom. Unlike the Assembly, however, its attendees were to be drawn from among the three estates, and would have the right to vote on proposals made by the king. Now, this was a somewhat flimsy excuse not to register the land tax. An Estates General hadn't been called since 1614, and since then plenty of taxes had been established. But it was argued that a tax so fundamentally different in scope and nature could only be registered by the Estates General and not merely the Parlement. So here's the question. Why on earth would the Parlement divest themselves of a say in this matter? Why palm authority to register taxes off to an Estates General? Well, it's a tricky question to understand, and requires grappling with two distinct factions that were now becoming clearly apparent within the Parlement. There were the Conservatives, opposed to reform in favour of austerity measures to assuage the national debt. Keenly aware of their privileges, these they would jealously guard against all encroachment. Like the Conservatives, the Liberals were keenly aware of their privileges too, but for very different reasons. The Liberals did believe that reform was the answer. Hell, a good many advocated for a far more comprehensive and total regimen for national economic reform centred around Enlightenment economic theories. Any such reform, however, could not impinge upon their rights and should take their input into account. For now, at least, the Liberals and the Conservatives aligned in opposition to the land tax, and so both concurred that the Estates General was needed. But a fracture was now sharpening in the heart of the Parlement. Those conditionally for reform, and those categorically against it. Controller General Brienne doggedly fought his uphill battle to pass the land tax, getting nowhere fast. Exhausted and exasperated, he went to the king in August and convinced him to deliver a lit de justice to the Paris Parlement. They refused to comply. An emergency council meeting was convened in which the king and Brienne decided that there was no alternative but to exile the Paris Parlement to Troyes until they cooled off and came to their collective senses. It was to prove a disastrous decision. Seemingly, it confirmed the Parlement's assertions that the king and his ministers were unrepentant absolutists who regularly abused their powers in order to muzzle dissent. Public opinion took another swift downturn against the king and his ministers. The result was riots and demonstrations out in the streets. Parlement rapporteur d'Amécourt, who had played so vital a role in the ousting of Cologne, had recently been reinstated. He made overtures to Brienne offering a compromise. As it was now August, Brienne had only a few months to take out some more loans to stave off France's creditors. Both he and d'Amécourt knew that the Parlement could make those loans happen. Staring down the barrel at bankruptcy yet again, Brienne gave in. Over the next few months, negotiations played out, and they were fully ratified at a séance royale on November 19th. The compromise saw the exile revoked, for which the Parlement dutifully provided permission for a further 500 million livres in loans to be taken. In exchange, Cologne's proposals for the modified vingtième were done away with. So too was the land tax, the cure abandoned for a palliative. Furthermore, the Crown agreed that the Estates General would be convened within the next 5 years. This concession implied that the Crown could only enact reforms with the approval of the Estates General and thus of the people of France. A total inversion of the traditional power dynamic of the Ancien Regime. Louis would not suffer this indignity lightly. He was still an absolutist ruler, after all. On the day of the November séance, he railed against the Parlement and made arbitrary decisions that flaunted legality or precedent. He acted like a bit of a dick, but remember he had seen his beloved reforms squelched. He couldn't let it be for nothing and would make sure by exercising his powers as an absolutist monarch. The Parlement rightly saw this as a flagrant disregard for the sanctity of this new Crown-Parlement compromise, and further proof of Louis's resort to despotism. This was only confirmed by the flippancy with which Louis had 2 particularly obstinate parlementaires imprisoned. Unsurprisingly, over the coming months, the compromise would start to collapse. This unravelling began with a ploy to subvert the Parlement, devised by Brienne and his Ministry of Finance. Basically, the duties of the Parlement would be confined to judgments on judicial and legal affairs. Their ability to register laws and taxes would be stripped away and instead conveyed upon a new organ, a plenary court stuffed to the gills with royalists and absolutists. Its powers would be far-reaching, applying all throughout France, and be backed up by the full weight of the royal ministry. What this amounted to was a coup against Parlement, and a complete reneging on the terms of the compromise. Well, if you can't go through the Parlement, better go over them. It was not all sunshine and rainbows for the absolutist court, however. Just as Brienne was busy establishing his plenary courts, Malesherbes, recalled and made a royal advisor, drew up plans to divest some judicial authority from the Parlement, limiting their purview even further. But he did so under duress, noting his reservations in private. To conduct a coup against one of the institutional pillars of the Ancien Regime was morally dubious, and all these changes would foment division for years to come. In a meeting of the Conseil de Roi, the king received these reservations of his trusted mentor with due consideration. But that the changes would be made was a foregone conclusion. The Conseil de Roi and the Committee des Finances both gleefully signed off on what would become the May Edicts. Parlement didn't take these changes lying down. They didn't come into effect until May 8th, giving the Parlement a few days to find a solution. Here 2 parlementaires named de Prémensil and de Montsabert worked tirelessly to cobble together a kind of unofficial French Magna Carta. Obscure laws and ancient writ, undergirded by contemporary legal precedent, formed the basis of their completed work. If this was not enough to guarantee the inviolability of the Parlement, then they would fight tooth and nail for their preservation. Stuff like denying further loans and unconditionally refusing to comply by royal edicts. What's more, they could always count upon the popular support of the people. For their part, de Clemenceau and Montseber were to be arrested. But before they could be picked up, they were warned by Brutai, whose sympathies were still firmly with the Parlementaires. Seeking protection, both physical and legal, with other members of the Parlement, our two Parlementaires were only apprehended on May 6th by the intervention of royal guards. Parlement attempted to stop these arrests, but soon their leaders were issued lettres de cachet, forcing them to stand down. Under pain of imprisonment or exile, they were to report to Versailles in 2 days to receive what turned out to be a tongue-lashing from Louis. There Louis defamed and denounced his guests, accusing them of all manner of backstabbing and immoral intrigue. By royal decree, he then simply enacted his edicts, completely bypassing the Parlement, and thus concluding the coup. The Paris Parlement was compelled to disperse under the implied threat of arrest or exile. Recent events had proved that Louis was not making idle threats. Make no mistake, the forceful enactment of the May edicts was an illegal, unprecedented abuse of power, and one that, as we shall see, was entirely counterproductive. Still, can you blame Louis for dropping all the pretext and finally utilising his prerogative powers? For 17 years he had dealt with the Parlement, and for 17 years he'd been given the runaround. All these years of deliberation, concession, back and forth, amounted to nothing. Bankruptcy still loomed, and the kingdom was little closer to solving any of its major financial problems. To call the late Ancien regime dysfunctional doesn't even begin to cut it. The aristocratic, out-of-touch Parlement had to be subjugated, or better yet replaced, if any real changes were to occur. In his mind, had the May edicts gone unopposed, Louis would have firmly grasped the torch that his forebears had lit and continued the legacy of Bourbon absolutism. Doing what was necessary for the good of the realm, damn the costs. But that is not how things transpired, and indeed almost immediately after the dissolution of Parlement, France was seething with revolt and violence, further exacerbated by yet another poor harvest that same year. Spurred on by pro-Parlement propaganda, public opinion, already soured against the king and the royal ministry, was effectively weaponized by the Parlement. Whipped up into a vicious frenzy, the peasants of Burgundy, Dauphine, Limousin, Béarn, Provence, and Brittany burned down magistrate buildings and tax offices. They also looted noble manors, withheld their taxes, and attacked royal officials. Crowds in Paris burned effigies of Brienne. Grenoble witnessed the so-called Day of Tiles, wherein dozens of soldiers were attacked with roofing tiles, resulting in troops opening fire into a massed crowd. Homes were burnt to cinders, official documents destroyed or seized, and royalist authorities were forced to flee in fear, or else. So it went for the intendant of Rennes, who was attacked by a mob when he came to dismiss the Parlement there. The violence of the mob had been visited upon the entirety of France for the first time during the Revolution. And from now on, demonstrations, riots and strikes would be a common and constant destabilizing influence. All the while, the Parlements of France were sure to stoke the flames of resentment. So how do we explain this spontaneous outburst of violence on the Parlement's behalf? What would possess the Third Estate to rise in support of the nobles of the French Parlement? Well, to understand what's going on, we'll look at the Third Estate in broad halves. So firstly, there were our educated middle class, the intelligentsia, the petite bourgeoisie. They are our men of letters, doctors, lawyers, academics, writers and journalists. A class thoroughly enamoured with Enlightenment ideals and ideas, but hitherto denied any voice in politics. And what better vehicle to political representation was there than the Parlement, champions of the Estates General? Promises of reform, to them, possess a distinctly political dimension. What might happen if they had their say in government? Gathered in the cafes and salons of France's cities, the middle class openly discussed this political future, one in which they would no longer be passive observers, but active participants. Then we have our working classes, urban poor, rural peasants, and artisans. They lived the day-to-day struggle of exclusion from politics. All of the fighting between the king and the Parlement had taken place against the backdrop of their immense human suffering. Harvests of the past few years had been utter failures. The scarcity of bread meant increased bread prices, and increased bread prices meant that the average price of bread rose from around 8 sous to 12 sous. As a result, the average French peasant or worker spent around 60% of their income on food alone, up from a prior 35%. The rest had to be spent on fruit, wine, a necessary product in a time before clean water, oil, fuel, and, if applicable, rent. And of course, that's to say nothing of tithes owed to the Catholic Church, or seigneurial dues owed to the feudal nobility. And would you believe it? But it only got worse in 1788. Hopes for the year's harvest were dashed when hailstones the size of bowling balls reportedly came down in torrents across the otherwise productive farmlands of northern France. Oh, and to top it all off, France suffered one of its coldest winters on record, a cool gift from the Little Ice Age. Again, bread became scarce, prices rose, and poverty metastasized across the kingdom. With the lower and middle classes cash-strapped like never before, entire sectors of the French economy began to collapse. For instance, hat and glove makers had absolutely no market left. Luxury goods were simply no longer in any sort of demand. Only the barest necessities of life were needed. Clothes, food, fuel. Everything else was extraneous, and ridiculously expensive too. Thus, Parlement posed a distinctly economic promise, affixed to all these material woes that so disproportionately ailed the Third Estate. So between the politically disaffected middle classes and the economically downtrodden peasantry, all of Parlement's propaganda, populist rhetoric, and pamphleteering found an extremely receptive audience. Yet this success did pose a problem for Parlement. All of this talk was just that, talk. They had no goals other than their own objectives. The propaganda was there to sway public opinion, so as to put pressure on the royal ministry, nothing more. Certainly, there was very little stomach for any sort of political or economic reform. Though the Parlements of France, especially the Paris Parlement, would liberalise and radicalise from this point onwards, they were for now still fundamentally conservative, little concerned with the well-being of the peasantry. So its propaganda was rich when it described Parlement as the final bulwark against royal absolutism, or as the vigilant defender of the rights of the people against oppression and exploitation. Actually following through with this populist political philosophy, however, was a step too far for most parlementaires. Indeed, many felt intimidated when the people rose up in their defence. Parlement could expect to ignore the Third Estate at their peril. This first taste of liberty had a profound, electrifying effect on French politics. As the flames of revolt ripped across the kingdom, Brienne's Ministry of Finance found itself incapable of implementing the May edicts. Simply put, the regional assemblies and municipal governments refused to comply with these new edicts. Additionally, in solidarity with the Parlement, the entire legal profession went on strike, completely paralysing the French judiciary. Thus, when Brienne went to fill his new plenary courts, he found almost no willing participants. This meant that the May edicts went unimplemented. They never had a chance to do what they were meant to do, fix the financial situation. By August, the kingdom was very nearly bankrupt yet again. The crown had only 400,000 livres. The previous year, Parlement had extended credit for yet another bout of loaning. There would be no such provisions this time around. Knowing this, Brienne turned in desperation to his fellow men of the cloth in the First Estate. What he wanted was an extension on the 5-year gift the French Catholic Church provided to the crown in lieu of taxation. What he got was a humiliating rejection, and only a fraction of the full gift. Like the nobility and the Parlement, the clergy refused to abide an absolutist or his agents. Bowing to pressure from the people and the Parlement, it became an inescapable reality that the crown would have to honour its word and convene the Estates General. Brienne made as much clear to Louis, who reluctantly concurred. This was to be Brienne's final act. Exhausted and embarrassed, he resigned his post in August, retiring to Seine. Brienne's departure had been hastened by Marie Antoinette, who plotted from the shadows to have the Controller General removed. Although he had been the Polignacs plant, he had outlived his usefulness, and was now political poison. Moreover, the Queen's chosen replacement hated Brienne's guts and refused to join the government until he was ousted. Can you believe it, but Jean-Jacques Necker, Swiss extraordinaire, makes his triumphant return to Versailles, reinstated as Director General. With a good deal of support from the Parlement and the nobility, and as the darling of the press, it was an appointment met with considerable optimism. His return to the helm, however, was conditional. It was by the Queen's grace that he had been reappointed, and it was by the Queen's grace that he remained appointed. That much was made abundantly clear to Necker. Strangely enough, Louis didn't do anything to block the reappointment. As much as he hated Necker, it seems he chose to go along with his return. Why exactly? Political expedience, trust in Necker's financial acumen, a belief that it would take a banker to restore French credit? Perhaps, but it seems that Louis was still suffering the effects of a profound depression at this time, a personal struggle only exacerbated by his war with the Parlement. In one notable instance, he was on a hunt and stopped by some trees for a while. There he sat, crying for a time, until retrieved by his retinue. Necker's appointment as Director General of Finances was confirmed on August 25th. He was intent upon restoring French credit at all costs. At all costs included the May Edicts, for which Malesherbes was now the only surviving architect. As Malesherbes negotiated to have some of his reforms retained, Necker negotiated to have the Parlement fully reinstated and the May Edicts functionally revoked. Seeing that Necker was winning out, Malesherbes pleaded with Louis, asking for a lit de justice to compel the Parlement to keep the edicts intact. This was something Marie Antoinette could not abide. The restoration of the Parlement, as she sought, was the only way forward. A lit de justice could plunge France into another bout of revolts. Malesherbes had to be stopped. At a committee meeting on September 12th, she made her case to the king and didn't spare Malesherbes her derisive humour. Necker echoed her case and claimed that Parlement was planning on utilising its popular support to force concessions upon the king. Restoration now would nip this in the bud. Still, it was not clear that Louis would agree to revoke the lit de justice, scheduled to be issued on September 15th. It was only as parlementaires were filing into the palace on the morning of the 14th that he finally gave in to Necker and Marie Antoinette, lifting the lit de justice, essentially condoning the restoration of the Parlement. Seeing his efforts dashed to pieces, Malesherbes resigned as Keeper of the Seals, the office being passed on to Charles Louis de Barentin. So the revitalized Parlement reconvened in Paris, and with Necker back at the wheel, attention returned to the Estates General. July of 1789 was tentatively set as the starting date for the Estates General. But before it could happen, two major questions had to be answered. First things first, what the hell would the Estates General even be for? Remember, the sole reason Parlement had invoked the Estates General was to create a roadblock for the reforms of Calonne and then Brienne. It had no raison d'etre beyond screw the Ministry of Finance, so what could it possibly be for now? The second question begged was what form the Estates General would even take. The answer to this question was to prove extremely contentious and, as it turned out, extremely consequential. Conservatives in the Parlement saw no need to change the form from that of 1614. Even thirds, a few hundred delegates from each estate, hashing things out at the king's discretion. But here's the thing. This would guarantee no substantive changes would be agreed upon. At even thirds, the voting power of the clergy and nobility, who were basically linked at the hip, would always outweigh that of the Third Estate. Well, that was fine by the Conservatives. The Estates General had no real purpose anymore, so who cares if it's a deadlocked farce? Well, the Liberals cared, and that's because they had an answer to the first question, what this is all for. The long and short of it, reform. The emerging Liberal faction, a motley assortment of bourgeoisie, bankers, lawyers, Enlightenment thinkers, and an influential clique of Liberal nobles, would, from here on out, adopt the mantle of reform. The vanguard for a renewed reformist effort that emanated not from Bourbon absolutism, but rather Enlightenment liberalism. So just how could the Liberals ensure equitable voting at the Estates General? Simple. Double the size of the Third Estate's delegation. This had been put into practice once before in Dauphine by a radical young lawyer, Jean-Joseph Monnier. An Estates Provincial had been convened in which his proposal that the Third Estate's delegation be doubled was implemented to great success. Double representation in this fashion equalized the voting blocs, at the very least guaranteeing that reforms wouldn't be dead on arrival. As you might imagine, the Liberals advertised their proposal in the newspapers and periodicals they owned and published. Commoners among the Third Estate absolutely adored the idea of double representation. But the Conservatives, well, they were not so supportive. God forbid this proposal pass and the Third Estate have a real, actual voice in politics. The anti-absolutist cohesion of the recent past was utterly undone by the schism emerging over the issue of double representation. Parlement split right down the middle, Conservatives on one side and Liberals on the other. And the Conservatives had the upper hand. Failing to make headway in day-to-day proceedings, the Liberals retreated to where they felt safest, the salons, cafes and coffeehouses of the Parisian political underground. Here they networked, cooperated, organised, and very soon a proper Liberal bloc coalesced, a movement that advocated reform. As a general rule, these guys were advocates of the separation of church and state, scientific government, and liberal economic reform. But it was all well and good to talk about reform, and another thing entirely to actually do it. And with the Conservatives dominant, this seemed like a stark impossibility. Thus, the disenfranchised Liberals turned to the people, the beginning of a very topsy-turvy marriage. For now, the Liberals' reformist ideas spread far and wide through their highly developed propaganda networks. Newspapers, cartoons, pamphlets. If you couldn't read, that was fine. Street corners were always chock full of announcers reading aloud the latest papers for eager listeners. Enlightenment ideals were disseminated throughout the Third Estate. Subversive, dangerous, radical new ideas were injected right into the bloodstream of the body politic. Right into the urban poor, who were well primed for political action. And one idea in particular struck a chord with beggars and lawyers alike. An idea that represented a shift away from mere economic reform and to substantive political reform. A constitution. For Liberals, it was the ultimate expression of an Enlightenment vision. A document that would form the cornerstone of their political project. And for the rest of the Third Estate, it meant a starting point for economic reform, potentially an end to their hunger and privation. Grander ideas like universal rights and the general will would come later. For now, the constitutional question was the hot topic. A question to which the Conservatives had their own answer. We've already beaten Louis back, they argued. Shackling him with a constitution was unconscionable. It had never been done before, and was anathema to the purpose of the nobility, to ensure the stability and preservation of the realm and its traditions. So Parlement was not going to furnish the Liberals with their constitution. But this became a very difficult position to adopt publicly. Actually, it became a dangerous position to adopt publicly. Liberal press lashed the Conservatives, and they lashed back in all-out propaganda warfare. Louis watched the parliamentary civil war with glee, and his ministers clandestinely supported the press of both sides. They also opened up the political conversation, relaxing laws against assembly and political clubs, as well as relaxing censorship laws. The hope was that this would fuel the passions that had caused the Conservative-Liberal split in the first place. Well, this it did, but it also had the vicarious effect of fostering political discourse amongst the Third Estate. Very soon, this decision will come to haunt the absolutists. So, towards the end of 1788, what we can recognise as revolutionary thought had emerged among the upper rungs of the Third Estate, and percolated down to the masses. As a result, they were riled up something fierce. The open nature of Parlement's proceedings, in which crowds of commoners were present as audience members, involved the public intimately in the furious debates that were so common in the Parlement. And all of this was part of the plan of a secretive club of liberals dubbed the Committee of 30. Magistrates, liberal nobles, lawyers, scholars, and even a few liberal clergymen, they include some figures who are worth introducing as they will become indispensable in the story of the Revolution. The first and most infamous, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, a figure who will loom large in French politics long after the Revolution is over. Born into a family of the noblesse de robe, he began his long and storied career in the Church, where he rose through the ranks to become an agent general, the Church's government representative, and then the Bishop of Autun in 1788. At the moment, he was involved in organising the elections to the Estates General, and he himself would end up winning a seat representing the First Estate. Certainly his erudition and education informed this choice. Even in seminary school, he had devoured the works of the philosophes and developed his own rational and enlightened worldview, somewhat sympathetic to the hardships of the lower classes. Even this early in his career, Talleyrand was noted for his tactful negotiations and oratory skills. These skills he combined with ambition. He was only really a member of the Church to get ahead in life, not really out of any sort of theological conviction. His eyes were firmly fixed on politics. A political animal, if ever there was. Next is the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, an early sociologist and a very talented writer. He had made a name for himself in January of 1789 with his highly influential work, What is the Third Estate? In it, he effectively argued in favour of decoupling the Third Estate from the clergy and nobility. This genuine belief in civic egalitarianism and constitutionalism put him in good company among the other committee members and liberal parlementaires. Another important figure I'll mention is Jean-Sylvain Bae. He's going to be very important. Bae was a Parisian to his core, spending most of his youth and formative years living, studying, and working in the City of Light. Before the Revolution, Bae was best known as one of France's, if not Europe's, preeminent astrologers, rightly famous for charting the trajectory of Halley's Comet. He also wrote histories on astronomical study and descriptions of the Jovian moons. During this time, he was made a senior member of the Academy of Sciences. So it is perhaps unsurprising that in addition to being drawn into Academy politics, he was drawn into Paris politics too. Though very much someone who worked within a rational, enlightened tradition, Bae was not a partisan, and was thus a fairly inoffensive delegate acceptable to all members. A wonderful consensus candidate. And then we have the Marquis de Lafayette. He's cropped up quite a bit already, but I haven't properly introduced him yet. The orphaned son of an immensely wealthy aristocratic lineage, Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche-Guibert de Motier had been born a zealous and idealistic young man. His restless passions took him to America, where he was hardened by his wartime experience in the American War of Independence. But though hardened, he was no less infatuated with the dreams of personal liberty, equality, and constitutionalism he had seen firsthand turned from abstract political thought into the basis of a functional government. A war hero, comrade-in-arms to the founders of the United States. These achievements in America didn't translate terribly well into political success for the young Marquis. Transparently ambitious and outspoken, he was a bull in the political china shop, abutting on matters he had little or no experience in. Pursuing his own unorthodox political path, Lafayette earned ire or admiration in equal measure. Though not a parlementaire, Lafayette showed his true colours by openly siding with the Liberals. Though his intention was likely to use the split as an avenue for personal advancement, the Marquis was nonetheless a true believer, having seen liberal constitutionalism and republican institutions in action. So, to get back on track, a new year dawned, and the elections for the delegates to the Estates General began. Voting was confined to males of 25 who paid in excess of 6 livres on the taille. This deliberately exclusivist policy guaranteed that only fairly well-off Frenchmen could vote on whom would represent their interests. Turnout was strong, as public interest in the proceedings was very high. Before elections began, letters of grievance were issued to the royal ministers by the three estates. In these letters were proposals for what reforms might be acceptable, but also condemnation for the king's absolutism. All three estates agreed on a baseline. Going forward, there would have to be reduced censorship, stronger laws against corruption, some sort of provincial assembly to adjudicate on regional matters, and an empowered Estates General. Obviously, the Liberals wanted to take things further, write a constitution, one that ensured civil liberties, freedom of the press, and instituted liberal economic reform. Even a few Conservatives found themselves liking the idea of a constitution. Well, maybe not a constitution per se, but a compact between the king and the aristocracy, or a guarantee that the Estates General would be called every few years or so. Others would hew the absolutist line, come what may. The First Estate had some unique demands too. Many of their more senior members wanted to disentangle the Church from Rome and pursue closer ties with Paris. More junior members set their sights on alleviating poverty out in the provinces and in the cities. Point's this: all three estates had their own sometimes mutual, sometimes exclusive aims. And even within the estates, there was little homogeneity of opinion. Now the delegation for the First Estate, the clergy, numbered 295, most of whom were the highly popular rural parish priests who enjoyed close ideological and personal ties to each other. Some were bishops and priests from France's cities who were not so unified a bloc. Many among the delegate priests were well versed in the liberal theories of the Enlightenment, and this fact would become instrumental in the outcome of the Estates General. The Second Estate, the nobility, were 278 strong, and consisted mostly of landed conservative nobles. A mere 22 were noblesse de robe from the Parlement, with even fewer among the entire lot identifying as liberal, though that small number did include such men as the inestimable Marquis de Lafayette. They were an aristocratic body through and through, there to guarantee the rights and privileges of the established feudal elite. And of course, there was the Third Estate, around twice the size of the other two, at some 604 delegates. Overrepresented was the middle class, lawyers, magistrates, doctors, professionals, those sorts. Artisans and the peasantry were not directly represented at all. The delegation for the Third Estate, however, was predominantly liberal in persuasion. A coherent, consistent consensus unified the many enlightened individuals of the delegation. And it was clear from the get-go that they would push hard for liberal reform. Various parties began filing into Paris and Versailles throughout April, in prelude to the Estates General. Before the meeting could begin in earnest, small delegations from each estate were directed to confer with Louis in Versailles on May 2nd. Court protocol was strictly observed, and deferential treatment was given to the clergy and nobility, who, dressed in their finest embroidered plumages and official attire, were both warmly received by the king in the Hall of Mirrors. On the other side of the hall, however, was the delegation from the Third Estate, including, among others, the Comte de Mirabeau. Unlike the clergymen and nobility, they did not benefit from the king's hospitality, and were deliberately snuffed. Louis, for his part, was very reluctant to even meet them. He didn't know any of them, and thought it below his dignity. After this cool reception, the delegation from the Third Estate retired, their pride wounded. The following day, the preliminaries were held in smaller, unofficial venues, mostly cafes, hotels, and halls rented out by the delegates. As if destined, the portents of the previous day's royal meeting came to pass. The nobility and clergy aligned, and were absolutely incensed that the Third Estate was even open to the idea of a constitution. Such a thing could not be tolerated. Debates quickly cropped up, and spiraled out of control into vicious public denunciations. This didn't bode well on the eve of the Estates General. Despite the ill will and the bad blood, the estates made a show of solidarity, and gathered in the Place d'Armes, then afterwards proceeding to a mass at the Church of Saint-Louis on May 4th. Even here, social etiquette was strictly enforced. The Third Estate led the way, followed by the red-robed nobles and the black-cloaked clergy. The king and queen bore witness to the spectacle, and reportedly cheers of Vive le Roi punctuated Louis's visit. Marie Antoinette, however, was not greeted with cheers but with cold, contemptuous silence. The estates sat through the agonizingly dry sermon given by the Bishop of Nancy. Then the king took to the podium. After his perfunctory speech, in which he described himself as the people's greatest friend, Louis slept through the remainder of the sermon, much to the dismay of all gathered. The opening ceremony began on May 5th in the Hôtel de Menu de Plaisir, a theatre now called the Château de Versailles. The first and second estates were permitted to enter before the third. The second estate were not given a strict dress code, and so the nobles were attired in their finest, most pompous and pretentious garb. Likewise, the clergymen wore rich silk robes and hats topped with feathers. By contrast, the third estate were required to wear no hats and all black damask. As they shuffled in to take their place, it was clear that many had elected to openly defy these rules, and flaunted their finest. The king entered soon thereafter, decked out in his plush royal robes. Louis took to the stage and looked out over the hall, putting on his reading glasses. He then made the speech that opened the Estates General. As was typical, most of the words were not his own. The speech he delivered was a motley amalgam of various scripts and partial paragraphs donated to him by his ministers and even the Queen. Only the last few lines were definitely his own. Overall, it went well, short and sweet. The same could not be said for Necker's speech, which came after the new Keeper of the Seals, the Comte de Barentin, made a perfunctory address. Necker's was a dry, technical, and ponderous speech by a dry, technical, and ponderous man. It lasted 2 or 3 hours, and halfway through he lost his voice. So in a raspy monotone he rattled off what must have seemed like every figure in every ledger and account in the kingdom. Knowingly, Necker skirted the issue of how votes would be counted, that is to say by individual or a unified vote from each estate. It was a prickly issue, and one mired in controversy. As it was, Necker had come around to the idea that this was up to the estates to decide. Realistically, it should have been solved on May 3rd, or even earlier, by the king. Closing, Necker stated that the reforms he proposed would avert the financial crisis, and thus the estates ought to just ratify them. But the estates were under the impression that they were here to modify and compromise on the reform package, not merely rubber stamp it. Overall, the opening ceremony was a bit of a non-starter. Still, at least the delegates knew the national debt down to the last sou. On the following day, the estates attended each their separate conventions. Within the Château de Versailles, the Third Estate discussed the first issue of importance to them: the credentials of the supervisors appointed to oversee proceedings. You see, these deputies were not chosen by those assembled, but instead by the king's ministers, and had yet to be confirmed by their respective estates. Clearly, the supervisors were there to keep the Third Estate in check, and so their motives and credentials were questioned. Since Necker had failed to clear the air during the opening ceremony, the debates around credentials, verification, and official oversight raged on for days. It wasn't long before order broke down. The rulings of the royally appointed supervisors, there to oversee proceedings, and rules and regulations especially, were completely ignored. Control over the Third Estate was impossible. In the end, the royal supervisors mostly gave up. Impassioned speeches by many delegates convinced the majority that the verification of the rolls and the credentialing of all supervisors had to be done by a process of vote by head. Theoretically, this would mean a more representative total tally of the voting results, and better reflect actual opinion. On only their second day, the Third Estate had defied the king's attempts to rein them in. In the absence of the Parisian delegation, which would not arrive until late May, the delegations from Dauphine and Brittany proved to be the most proactively liberal group in the vote-by-head camp. They were more engaged in the politics and debate than many other groups, often meeting outside of hours to confer, earning these delegates membership in the sarcastically named Breton Club. These radical liberals and reformers were the progenitors of the revolutionary movement, which would grow to dominate the emergent political left. So after much fuss, the Third Estate decided that it would not recognize the deputies. The Second Estate had no such qualms, and apart from its minuscule liberal clique, voted in favour of the supervisors, and thus in favour of remaining separate from the other estates. Opinion was divided, however, among the First Estate, where the parish priests were generally in favour of the Third Estate's determination. But the bishops succeeded in holding the line, with 133 for vote by order and 114 for vote by head. Necker's double representation made the voting and debating power of the Conservatives and Liberals within each estate about even, and so a political impasse was soon reached. The nobility and bishops among the clergy aligned on most issues and formed a bloc against the unruly Third Estate. This was very dangerous for the Third Estate. A unified clerical noble bloc could vote down any of their determinations. This bloc had to be breached, and so feelers were sent out to the First Estate, intending to recruit some liberal clergymen and create a small but impactful group of reformist clergy who might break the monopoly of the combined First and Second Estates. The effect of this move was immense. The clergy became fiercely divided between liberal and conservative factions. Meanwhile, a Trojan horse was given to the Second Estate. They were invited to debate the issue of credentials with the Third Estate in the Château de Versailles. Debate raged, but the aristocrats badly misjudged the craftiness of the Third Estate, because the first clerical defectors had arrived. Despite the protestations of the nobles, dissenters among the clergy eagerly entered the hall after a delay of some hours. They tipped the balance in favour of the Third Estate. The Second Estate had been deeply insulted, and so withdrew from deliberations on the 26th of May. They then petitioned the king to wrangle the unruly Third Estate and guide them towards compromise with the other estates. But between his barely disguised contempt for their order and lack of tact, Louis bungled the matter. Nearing the end of May, Necker was thus forced to break his silence and come out with a proposal that decisively favoured the clerical noble bloc. There would be voting by order, no buts. In the event of an impasse, the king would cast the deciding vote. That being said, Necker was willing to allow the credentials of the supervisors to be questioned. Hopefully, this would mollify some in the Third Estate. It did not. They protested fiercely, going so far as to claim not to recognise any intermediary between the king and his people on June 3rd. To set matters straight, a deputation under Jean-Sylvain Bae demanded to see the king immediately. Before they could get to him, however, Necker intended to go to the king to force implementation of his proposals. Both sides were to be disappointed, because they found Louis in no fit state to do much of anything. In the early hours of June 4th, his young son, Louis-Joseph, succumbed to a bout of tuberculosis at age 7. The king was distraught and shut himself off. This, however, could not last in light of the Estates General. Between personally organising his son's funeral, Louis caved to incessant demands and met with Bailly's delegation. Offended at their untimely arrival and lack of respect for a father's grief, it's no surprise that this meeting failed to bear fruit. Louis's absence in both public affairs and affairs of state resulted in the failure of the Estates General. Necker never got the chance to use the king's power to break the deadlock, and so the deadlock remained fixed. The most immediate consequence was for the three estates to cease deliberations and retire. For all intents and purposes, the Third Estate and the clerical noble bloc were irreconcilable. As much was clear to the Abbé Sieyès. The past month's experience had demonstrated the unwillingness of the nobles and the bishops to compromise or even negotiate with the Third Estate. To get out ahead and start to remedy the ills that ailed France, Sieyès asserted that it was necessary to discard both and forge ahead unilaterally. To this end, the Third Estate had to establish itself as the sole representative body for the kingdom at large. A bold and completely unprecedented declaration. But what to call this new representative body? It was a difficult question to answer. The name had to imply authority, convey legitimacy, and break with naming conventions of the past. Sieyès had his own ideas, others had theirs. The matter was only settled when the Comte de Mirabeau entered the verbal melee. I've mentioned Mirabeau a few times before, but it seems like the right time to introduce a figure who will play such a pivotal role in the years to come. Pockmarked and round like a globe, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti de Mirabeau, native to the verdant Loire Valley, was regarded by friends and enemies as combative, rude, and overbearing. By this stage, he was already a well-established intellectual and reformer, functionally the arch-liberal of the Third Estate. Despite the strictness of his upbringing at the hands of a disciplinarian father and a short career in the cavalry, the Comte's life leading up to the revolution was basically one great big rebellious streak. A serial adulterer, gambler, and dissident, deeply indebted, his personal enlightenment was therefore less a product of intensive, candlelit study like his peers, but derived more from lived experience. Prior to the revolution, he had been subjected to the injustices of the lettre de cachet, not once, but twice, locked away in the Bastille. He had also been on the receiving end of a good number of lawsuits, which rarely went his way. The price of his indiscretions was the renunciation of his titles under legal pressure from his family. For this reason, he had no land and thus did not qualify for election to the Second Estate delegation. That suited Mirabeau just fine. He hated the nobility vehemently, despite being from their order. Mirabeau's proposal for renaming the delegation the Representatives of the French People was fiercely debated. Deputy Bae even lost control of the floor to the hundreds of members engaged in raucous debate. The Abbé Sieyès, however, had the final say, when one of his allies proposed conferring upon the Third Estate the name of the National Assembly. After an almost unanimous vote in favour, the title was adopted. On June 17, 1789, the National Assembly was officially established, transforming the delegation from the Third Estate into what they believed was the sole representative body in all of France. Earlier in the year, the Abbé Sieyès had posited a rhetorical quandary. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been hitherto in the political order? Nothing. What does it desire to be? Something. Well, their aspirations had been realized. The Third Estate really was now something. A National Assembly.